This is Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 4, the Rise and Fall of Nixon with the Southern Strategy. We've already talked about the Southern Strategy briefly. The Southern Strategy is Nixon's attempt to make sure that the South, which had started to trend Republican, stayed Republican. He realized that when he was running for re-election in 1972, Nixon realized that he had been elected as a minority president with only 43% of the vote. And he said, the best thing I can do is shore up my support in the rapidly changing South. And his so-called Southern Strategy succeeded in permanently breaking up the old Roosevelt coalition of white Southerners in the Democratic Party. From the time of Nixon to today, white Southerners would no longer even bother flirting with the Democratic Party. They are today the foundational base of the Republican Party. In the election of 1972, Nixon is running for re-election based on changes that are happening in America that are not attractive changes to his so-called silent majority. Nixon has appointed conservative justices to the Supreme Court. He took civil rights off of the front burner as black nationalism, urban riots, and increased black radicalism came to define a lot of race relations. That the optimism and the hopefulness of Martin Luther King in the early and mid-1960s had been replaced by race riots, forced busing, black nationalism, the Nation of Islam, rapidly skyrocketing black crime, and Nixon stands as a law and order man against all of these things. He also opposed forced school busing. Many cities had initiated forced school busing to forcibly integrate schools. That if there was a white neighborhood with a white school and a black neighborhood with a black school, students would be bused to the opposing schools to achieve a racial balance. Parents of both races did not much like that. Southerners especially do not much like that. Nixon continues attracting Southern votes with a hawkish foreign policy. The South tends to be more hawkish than the rest of the nation. He gives lip service at least to states' rights. Nixon and his Southern Strategy made Southern whites feel right at home in the Republican Party for the first time. And the extent of the success of the switch in parties, that Southern states are now Republican states, can be summed up with some data here. Since the end of Reconstruction, the election of 1880 to the election of 1968, that is 88 years of elections, that's 22 elections, right? 88 divided by 4. Yeah, 22 elections. When we think of the South, we're going to consider the South the states of the old Confederacy, the 11 states of the Confederacy. In the 22 elections from 1880 to 1968, those Southern states had voted for a Republican 25 times out of 254 opportunities. That's 9.8% of the time. So over 90% of the time, Southern states for those 88 years voted Democratic. Since the election of 1972 through the last election in 1912, those same states voted Republican 80% of the time. It was a complete and utter switch. The Democrats switched to the Northeast, so it ended up kind of being even anyway. And this is the strategy that Nixon ran on in 1972. The Republican Party changed, but so did the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party took on its modern form, really, in 1972. That the old Democrats, the ethnic whites, private labor unions, like industrial labor unions, had been taken over, if you will, by so-called New Democrats. And the Democratic Party of Roosevelt and Truman had focused its concern on working-class white ethnics. The New Democratic Party turns its focus towards various minority groups with grievances against the American systems. Working-class whites still make up a big part of the Democratic Party, but the focus of the Democratic Party from 1972 to today is anti-war activists, racial and ethnic minorities, feminists, leftists, environmentalists, and youth. That's the modern Democratic Party. Those group of people plus the remaining white working class people who have not become Republicans. That's the current Democratic Party. Those new Democrats took control of the Democratic Party at the 1972 convention. And because the anti-war activists, racial and ethnic minorities, feminists, leftists, environmentalists, etc., took control, they nominated this man at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. There he is. That's George McGovern. They nominated, in 1972, the Vietnam War is still going on, they nominated George McGovern of South Dakota for president. He runs on an explicitly anti-war platform. It's a clear choice in 1972. McGovern will end the war. Nixon is still fighting for a negotiated settlement. McGovern, the dovish Democrat, the anti-war Democrat, drives millions of working class whites who still supported the war into Nixon's camp. Makes him deeply unpopular. He's further damaged by his choice of a vice president, Thomas Eagleton. Thomas Eagleton, unbeknown, he had never released this to the press, had undergone psychiatric care, including electroshock treatments. That forced late in the campaign McGovern to change his running mate. His competence, his decision-making came under fire. But as you can see in the map, 1972 was an absolute landslide for Richard Nixon. The Democratic Party, or the New Democrats at least, mistook their own feelings for the feelings of the entire nation. The silent majority, those people who are never on the news, swept Nixon back into power in an overwhelming landslide. Nixon won over 60% of the vote and 520 electoral votes to McGovern's 17. McGovern won the state of Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. That is it. So in 1972, Nixon used this Southern strategy, but didn't need the Southern strategy. That McGovern's anti-war stance and his seeming closeness with those New Democrats, the feminists, the environmentalists, the black radicals, drive millions of working class whites out of the Democratic Party and into the arms of the Republicans. Richard Nixon takes his second oath of office in January of 1973, having come to power in what was, up to that point, the largest landslide in American history. That McGovern had won only one single state.